Hi guys, it's Miss Christy. I've missed all of you so much. I miss walking in the door and having each of you hug me, and I miss hearing about your days and everything. I hope all is well at home with your families, safe. But I wanted to come on and start another one of the chapters from Big House in the Little Woods like we were reading before. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do any more projects, and I will miss that so much, but at least I get a chance to read some of the rest of the chapters that we were on. And so today we are going to start Dance at Grandpa's. Now the last chapter we read was about the sugar snow, and if any of you remember that, it's when the trees kind of thaw and the sap starts to come down, and the grandpa and pa and the uncles all go out and get all the sap in the buckets, and then they bring it home and they cook it in that kettle and they make maple syrup. Remember, we tasted the maple syrup versus the log cabin syrup, and you guys told me which one you liked better. Well, now they're all gonna go to Grandpa's house and have a little dance. So, and they were super excited because remember, back in those days, they don't ever get to see people. So they're at home all alone all the time. And so now they get to go and have a dance with all the surrounding neighbors from miles around. So they get to see people. So they're really excited and they get to wear all their really nice fancy clothes. And anyway, so here we go. Dance at Grandpa's. Monday morning, everybody got up early in a hurry to get started to Grandpa's. Pa wanted to be there to help with the work of gathering and boiling all the sap. Ma would help Grandma and the aunts make good things to eat for all the people who were coming to the dance. Breakfast was eaten and the dishes washed and the beds made by lamplight. Pa packed his fiddle carefully in its box and put it in the big sled that was already waiting at the gate. The air was cold and frosty and the light was gray when Laura and Mary and Ma, with baby Carrie, were tucked in snug and warm under the robes on the straw in the bottom of the sled. The horses shook their heads and pranced, making the sleigh bells ring merrily, and away they went on the road through the big woods to Grandpa's house. The snow was damp and smooth in the road, so the sled slipped quickly over it, and the big trees seemed to be hurrying by on either side. After a while, there was sunshine in the woods and the air sparkled. The long streaks of yellow light lay between the shadows of the tree trunks, and the snow was colored faintly pink. All the shadows were thin and blue, and every little curve of snowdrifts and every little track in the snow had a shadow. Pa showed Laura the tracks of the wild creatures in the snow on the sides of the road. The small, leaping tracks of cottontail rabbits, the tiny tracks of field mice, and the feather stitching tracks of snowbirds. There were larger tracks like dog tracks where foxes had run, and there were tracks of a deer that had bounded away into the woods. The air was growing warmer already, and Pa said that the snow wouldn't last too much longer. It did not seem long until they were sweeping into the clearing at Grandpa's house. All the sleigh bells jingling, Grandma came to the door and stood there smiling, calling for them to all come in. She said that Grandpa and Uncle George were already at work in the maple woods, so Pa went to help them, while Laura and Mary and Ma, with baby Carrie in her arms, went into Grandma's house and took off their wraps. Laura loved Grandma's house. It was much larger than their house at home. There was one big great room, and there was a little room that belonged to Uncle George, and there was another room for the aunts, Aunt Dosha and Aunt Ruby. And then there was the kitchen with the big cook stove. It was fun to run around the whole length of the big room, from the large fireplace at one end all the way to Grandma's bed under the window in the other end. The floor was made of wide, thick slabs that Grandpa had hewed from the logs with his own axe. The floor was smooth all over and scrubbed clean and white. The big bed under the window was soft with feathers. The day seemed very short while Laura and Mary played in the big room, and Ma helped Grandma and the aunts in the kitchen. The men had taken their dinners to the maple woods, so for dinner they did not even set the table, but ate cold venison sandwiches and drank milk. What's venison? It's deer meat, and you guys tasted it at the beginning of the year, so they had sandwiches made out of deer meat. But for supper, Grandma made hasty pudding. I would love to have pudding for supper, wouldn't you? So she stood by the stove, sifting the yellow cornmeal with her fingers into a kettle of boiling salted water. She stirred the water all the time with a big wooden spoon and sifted in the meal until the kettle was full of thick, yellow, bubbling mass. And I would consider that to be kind of like, I don't know if any of you have had cream of wheat. It's kind of like that, this pudding that she's making, but she made it with cornmeal. I don't know if any of you have ever had cornbread, but you make cornbread out of cornmeal, and I think that's kind of what she made with this hasty pudding. Oh, I lost my place like before. Then she set it on the back of the stove where it would cook very slowly. It smelled so good. The whole house smelled good. You know how when your mom cooks a big meal, the house smells so good and you can't wait to eat? Well, that's how it was. With the sweet and spicy smells from the kitchen, the smell of hickory logs burning with clear, bright flames in the fireplace, and the smell of a clove apple beside Grandma's mending basket on the table. The sunshine came in through the sparkling window panes, and everything was large and spacious and clean. Don't you love going to your grandma's house? I do. At supper time, Pa and Grandpa came from the woods, each on his shoulders a wooden yoke that Grandpa had made. It was cut to fit around their necks in the back and hollowed out to fit over their shoulders. From each end hung a chain with a hook, and on the hook hung a big wooden bucket full of hot maple syrup. Lots of work back then because they didn't have tractors to pick up those things, so they had to put the wooden thing on their shoulders and the heavy buckets hanging on the side, and they had to walk back from the woods with it on their shoulders. Here's a picture of Pa, or Grandpa probably, carrying back the buckets of syrup. Pa and Grandpa had brought the syrup from the big kettle in the woods. They steadied the buckets with their hands, but the weight hung from the yokes on their shoulders. Grandma made room for a huge brass kettle on the stove. Pa and Grandpa poured the syrup into the brass kettle. It was so large that it held all the syrup from all 4 buckets. Then Uncle George came with a smaller bucket of syrup, and everybody ate the hot, hasty pudding with maple syrup for supper. Have you ever had breakfast for dinner? We do at my house sometimes, and it sounds like that's kind of what they did that night. Uncle George was home from the army. He wore his blue army coat with the brass buttons, and he had bold, merry blue eyes. He was big and broad, and he walked with a swagger. Laura looked at him all the time. She was eating her hasty pudding because she had heard Pa say to Ma that he was wild. George is wild since he came back from the war, Pa had said, shaking his head as if he were sorry. But he couldn't help it. Uncle George had run away to be a drummer boy in the army when he was 14 years old. So at that point, I'm going to have to stop, and we will pick up with the rest of the dance party at Grandpa's. But right now, you know that they came in with the syrup, they dumped it in the big kettle, they poured it over their hasty pudding. You just learned that Uncle George was a little wild from the war, because war does that to men sometimes. The next reading will probably be about everybody coming over the next day and them having the dance party. So until next time, Miss you guys.